Welcome to Politics and Prose Bookstore. My name is Nicole Davidow. I'm an event staffer here at the store where we are hosting in-person events, virtual events, supported events, classes, book clubs, all sorts of fun stuff that can be found at politics-prose.com. Before we get started, a little bit of housekeeping. If everyone could check to make sure their phones are on silent, that would be much appreciated. Following the conversation today, we will have a Q&A. We ask that you come ask your question here at the stand-up mic so our audio can pick it up for our live stream. And then after that, we will have our signing line also that will start at this podium over here. We'll also ask that you fold up your chairs at the end of the event. I'll remind you of all of that later, though. So without further ado, tonight we're going to be talking about the case of 25-year-old Freddie Gray, whose fatal injuries while in the custody of the Baltimore police in 2015 sparked public outrage and protests. Gray's death was widely seen as another in a series of controversial uses of force by police officers against black people. A new book by investigative journalist Justine Barron, They Killed Freddie Gray, contains additional information about the case, the arrest, and the subsequent investigation and prosecution of the police officers involved. It's an impassioned and detailed account that makes clear how, in a number of ways, our institutions and system failed Freddie Gray. Justine is here with us this evening and be joined by a panel of others who have reported on or campaigned against the injustices in the American justice system. The panelists include Susan Simpson, a D.C. attorney who turned to podcasting in 2015 with the launch of Undisclosed, which she co-hosted for 6 years, reporting on wrongful convictions around the United States. She also co-hosted the political podcast The 45th, which ran from 2017 to 2021, and currently co-hosts Proof, a podcast featuring true crime stories. Joining us hopefully shortly will be April Goggans, an organizer with the Black Lives Matter DC. She recently launched #KeepDC4Me, a project committed to finding non-police solutions to intra-community violence and ending police brutality. Moderating the discussion will be Chuck Modiano, a sports writer who co-hosts The Collision, Where Sports and Politics Collide, on WPFW Radio here in DC. Please join me in welcoming these wonderful folks.
Thank you so much. I'll be moderating. Thank you so much for coming. This is a great book. I know because I read it, and it is meticulous. The research is meticulous. And when I read it, I loved it, and I got angry. Why is Justine Barron doing the work of what the corporate media should have been doing all along? It made me mad the more I read it and learned about some of the failings. We can't. Do you hear me fine? Okay, we could do this too. My voice, if this is better, then even better. And you know what? So that made me angry, Justine. And when I think about that, and I was reading your book, getting angry, I want to know, what are some of the misconceptions in Freddie Gray's death that you covered in the book that even surprised you, perhaps?
Yeah, it's a really long list. Most of what people were told is not true. The biggest misconception is that his death was caused by a rough ride in the van. So I don't know if that's a familiar narrative to you. I see some nods. Good. So we were told that his death happened while the van was taking him from stop to stop after he was arrested, and that he got thrown forward in the van from not wearing a seatbelt. So the whole media conversation was about seatbelts and rough rides. So police and prosecutors, the prosecutors who tried some of the officers, knew from right away, hours and days after Gray's arrest, that he was actually brutalized by police because they had incredibly detailed witness accounts that were similar to each other and corroborated by other evidence. So that would be the first and most important misconception. Who Freddie Gray was also kind of spun incorrectly. And a lot of this was, Chuck kind of suggested, it was a type of journalism called police say journalism, where the media was getting all of its information from the police department, and the police department was like very aggressively spinning out stories.
I like to use the word propaganda over here, just so you know.
Yeah, sorry about that. That makes no sense. So, yeah, it was propaganda. It was police-say journalism, and the police department is very, very good at churning out narratives to distract the public from what really happened. But there were witnesses, and the witnesses weren't heard.
You know, they sure weren't. And I guess I want a follow-up question to you, and then we open it up and hear from you as well, Susan. But when we talk about propaganda, and I had a chance to cover the Baltimore uprising as an independent journalist, it's this practice of taking a police statement when history says most of the time it is false, and just reprinting it verbatim. And that's not just what is done, but that is the way. It's taught that way, and where lies are printed by journalists. So when I think about media coverage, and we talk about the Freddie Gray case and the uprisings itself, what were some of the holes in the media coverage that you discovered?
Mostly just the marginalization and dismissal of witnesses. The witnesses, if you recall, there was a video evidence of Freddie Gray's arrest, and he was screaming, and his legs were dragging while he was being brought into the van. And so my investigation determined that he probably wasn't fatally injured there. It happened a little bit later that morning, but he was injured. And so very quickly, the police department said there's no evidence that he was actually injured. But there were like 20 witnesses to the first 2 stops of the van ride. Like the van stopped around the corner from his arrest. And, the journalists, the mainstream journalists treated the witnesses the same way that the police and prosecutors did, which was to regard them as suspicious, based on nothing. I don't know, maybe the color of their skin or the fact that they were saying something that they didn't want to hear. And so that was the major hole. And then, so then when you brought up the uprising, there was also, that may be another story, but, there was this idea that, like, the community just suddenly rioted out of nowhere. But there is a chapter in the book that explores the role that police played in provoking the night of rioting. So that was another major hole.
Is that where they left empty police cars right in the middle of the road? I learned about that from your book.
Yeah. People in Baltimore know this because people in Baltimore know about the legendary story of Mandauman Mall. And outside of Baltimore, people never found out that, in fact, on the night that Baltimore supposedly exploded into rioting, there was all of these police actions and these propaganda campaigns designed to kind of permit police to lock down certain areas and promote a riot. There were police cars that caught on fire mysteriously, and they didn't call the fire department. It's a very strange set of circumstances. And Mandauman Mall refers to where these kids got out of school that day, and the police locked down the transit center so they couldn't go home. And so there were all these teenagers stuck wondering, what's going on? Why can't I go home? And then police started to say that these kids were throwing rocks at police before it happened. So it was it's a lot. It was just a lot of lies, a lot of propaganda in a very short period of time.
And the name was The Anatomy of a Cover-Up. I want to be clear about that, the hashtag, the tagline on the book. Anatomy of a Cover-Up. But this started early. Hey, April. This started really when you were doing the Undisclosed podcast, right? So it's like I want to bring Susan into it, but I really want you to say how you started this book and where it formed, and then we're going to bring in Susan.
Yeah, so Undisclosed podcast, I don't know if you guys are familiar with it, but most people know about Serial and the Adnan Syed case, because that was sort of the most famous podcast of all time, and it really brought true crime into popular culture. And so with the Serial podcast, its narrative of Adnan Syed's guilt or innocence was very incomplete. It was like a lot of the coverage of the Freddie Gray case. It was just not good journalism. And so Susan and her partners picked up the baton. And so I don't know if you want to take it from there and talk about that.
Yeah, Serial was obviously a worldwide sensation. I listened with everyone else, started blogging about it, and through that ended up meeting Robbie and Colin, and we did, well, at the time it was just a podcast on Anon's case, and that turned into season 1 of Undisclosed. After we finished that up, we're like, well, we've got another podcast now, let's keep going. And there's no shortage of stories, unfortunately, out there. And through that, we met Justine and Amelia and started talking about other cases, including Freddie's case. And I forget who had the idea first to have y'all come on board, actually.
Maybe Dennis.
That's probably Dennis, actually. And we said, hey, look, this case, you've done some great work on it. We have a platform. How about you expand on it and tell the world what happened?
It was really cool of them to give a platform to this story, because one thing that the true crime genre doesn't really do is explore police brutality cases. And, it's kind of like a mission of mine for that to open up, because most of the cases in true crime are either sort of like milk carton murder cases, somebody was murdered and nobody solved it, or more recently, these innocence cases. But in both types, it's always about innocence. And when you have somebody killed by police, it can be more complicated. But these cases, like the Freddie Gray case, Sandra Bland, Alton Sterling, there's so many that are true crime mysteries and deserve that level of exploration.
Well, on that, why don't we see more police terror cases, police murder cases in the true crime genre? And do you believe that series could make some headway toward doing that?
Absolutely, yes, there's room for it, as Justine showed. I do think one problem with that genre is that it's not quote-unquote entertaining in the same way so much true crime is. You have to really get into the weeds and understand the story to appreciate that kind of journalism, which is what Undisclosed does for our coverage for innocence cases. It's not it's the meatier kind of true crime. It's in the weeds. It's very legalistic. It's not for the faint of heart. And people who like those stories are very much the audience for these narratives about the true story behind cases like Sandra Bland, and just police misconduct in general, not just brutality, but also other wrongs in the system. So there definitely is an audience out there who wants to hear it. It's also very hard work, though, to put those stories together, which is another barrier to it.
Thank you. So April, and we've known each other about a decade. April Goggans, I'm a big fan, so you need to be a fan. We heard the bio, and she's with Black Lives Matter DC chapter. But I think I want to add something to the bio that you already heard. One of the direct actions that were involved in the George Floyd uprising was April and a team of people wrote "Defund the Police" on the street in Washington, D.C. and painted it. And prior to that happening, the idea of cutting police funds and putting them towards resources, crazy things like schools and counselors and mental health specialists, things like that those reallocations, the idea of doing that was stuck in academia, was stuck in activist prison, until that paint next to Black Lives Matter forced CNN to cover it, forced MSNBC to cover it, and forced individuals who would never cover it, would ignore it, to reckon with this fact, something that is particularly important today as we maybe we'll have a time to address Atlanta, what's going on in Atlanta and Cop City later. But I want to stop there. I have to mention that, April. And as you look back in 2014, 2015, and look back at the Freddie Gray case, where are some of the media failings that you've seen?
Well, it's really interesting. I've been audiobooking this book, and I'm on, I don't know, hour 8 or something like that. It just helps to do that. And I remember being there both the night after the CVS burned, as well as we were there dancing in the street after Marilyn Mosby, announced that she was going to do this thing that was going to be so great. And, I think we learned a lot in looking back. First was nothing that happened on the ground we ever saw on the TV. And I know, but I saw a lot of people's careers get made. A lot of media who was there that is very, very famous and progressive now was like their first night. But those folks don't cover any of that anymore. And at the time, it was very surface, right? Because the people in Baltimore, like the people in Ferguson, like the people in DC, are the directly impacted. They don't want to hear from us. They don't hear from us when it happens. I'm looking at my sis Kenethia, who, along with us, writing defund, is while there was 50,000 to 100,000 people here for George Floyd, no one talks about DC folks. In fact, 2 people were killed by police during the uprisings here in DC. And so one of the things we did in the same vein of the defund mural was to write the names of local folks who had been killed by police. And her son, Marquise Austin, was one of those names that we made sure that we uplifted. And so part of that message was ascending of a message that these things that we saw in Baltimore, the things that we saw both on the ground, in the media, should be a lesson to all of us, because it's not just a Baltimore, a DC, or a LA machine of the media and the way that it just regurgitates the state, regurgitates the police. It is a very tightly woven, carefully crafted way to both challenge the truth through using, sound bites, but also at the same time, exploiting families who are grieving, because there's nothing like seeing a parent not doing what you're accusing everybody else in the city to do. And it's very exciting to people who don't live a life where police violence and police terror is an everyday occurrence.
Thank you. So I want to keep on this media topic, and this is really for everybody from their perspective. But you talked a lot about, Justine, how the police department used the media for their benefit, and April just spoke about that. How does that happen? How does the media and the police and prosecutors use media in a court of a public opinion to help their case, and particularly with you, Justine, in Baltimore?
I don't think people understand how much money the police departments have for PR. And not just the individual police departments. There are these consultant agencies behind the scenes of most big city police departments that are pulling a lot of the strings. They get these consultant deals from police departments. They actually place the commissioners in a lot of cities. William Bratton is a famous name. He was the commissioner of New York and then of LA, corrupt in both cities. Now he makes millions kind of pulling the strings behind the departments of a lot of cities. And he writes op-eds. And so it's very coordinated. I see a connection between the backlash to defund the police and what happened at Mandauman Mall. So what happened at Mandauman Mall was there was no protest on the day of Freddie Gray's funeral, but the police issued these propaganda warnings. The teenagers are going to purge. It was made up. There's a credible threat that gang members are going to wipe out police. It was also made up, and I have the sources for these. So that what happens is, and that is a model that happens, it's called the Miami model. A lot of cities are doing this. When there is protest, when there is backlash against policing, they make it sound more violent than it is. So that's what happened on the day with Mandauman. It was nonviolent protest in Baltimore. It was going to be a quiet day, but they spun this campaign that it's violent. They're doing that now with defund the police. They're saying if we defund the police, there's going to be violence. This is coordinated. It's not accidental. They do this on purpose.
I want, and everyone in April, maybe from a DC perspective.
Yeah. So, there's a narrative here. I mean, I don't know if people understand that there are 32 independent police departments in DC, and that doesn't include the 8 universities and 5 local departments. Each one of them has a cooperative agreement with MPD, which is our supposed to be DC police for just the general population. And one of the things that you'll hear every chief say, like decade after decade, is DC has the most like protest, community policing friendly police department in the country. And it is eaten up. It is eaten up to the point that guys on the street guys and non-binary folks, trans folks, everybody has just like dozens of videos of like all out police brutality, which I mean, most policing is brutal, but that they don't post because it's gotten to a point that no one actually cares in their eyes, right? There's no outrage, right? They chased Karan Hilton to his death during the uprisings here, and those officers just were, charged and convicted of murder, homicide murder. But and the news covered it while they were in court. But and I'll say this: the police create the conditions for which to brutalize and kill us, right? And I'm sorry, sis. I'm gonna keep talking about Marquise because this was the case for me and for us, Marquise Alston, that I realized we could put all of this together and connect it to the media. Is that in almost every case, the police, and this is DC, the police will chase no matter what they think you did or didn't do. Like, they don't even have to just, tell anybody why. They chase, and they chase in a way that automatically assumes both criminality, guilt, and this is clearly happens all over, but and it's those police that people also want to send into our communities as much as possible when they're talking about violence, right? So right now we've got an uptick in violence, or like everybody in the country does. And so every time these same police chase people, beat them, the media will play 6 stories about somebody else getting killed, right, in community violence. And you hear the same words over again. You will not hear police murder or even police shooting. You will hear officer-involved shooting. And so when we start in a community and society to replay these kinds of descriptions of the end of Black life, and it's the same as I was actually just kind of floored at the detail that you went into with the descriptions of why it was okay to kill George Floyd, right? It's not just the assassination, not George Floyd, Freddie Gray.
Well, George Floyd too.
Right, yes, absolutely,
thing.
right.
They did the same thing.
Exactly, to a T. That they took everything that could possibly be connected to criminality and blackness. And even though they created like 16 different ways to say that he deserved to be killed, right. Yeah, it was taken and it was ran with, and nobody scrutinized. It was just like, this is great. Yes, that makes sense. Some lead. Yes, all the Black kids in lead makes sense. Projects. Yeah.
Yeah, the lead paint poisoning narrative was, it was like there was 2 narratives about Freddie Gray. There was like a conservative narrative that he was this ingrate, terrible, violent criminal. And it was based on a record of arrests, but a lot of the arrests had been dropped because there was no probable cause and they were not violent arrests. And he was actually like a really lovable person in his community. And then there was this liberal media perception of him, which was that his life was just a tragedy because he had lead paint poisoning and was poor. Therefore, and this language was used, he was inevitably going to die, or that his life was doomed. And so that was just like another major misconception in a lot of the media. And there was really no, and again, it was about the same community. Like, the people who witnessed Freddie Gray's killing by police were his neighbors who could have told the press about the actual person. But instead they just ran with like, what was easier, just criminal records, civil records from a lead paint, lawsuit. And so this person was killed by police. He became this like symbol, but for the most part, the world never really got to know who he was.
That's a big part of it. It's just easier to do stories this way. A reporter's never going to get in trouble for quoting the police, quoting court records. You just get it handed to you. You say, here's what the cops say, here's what the court records say, and you're done. Your boss is never going to get mad at you for that. Meanwhile, going into the streets and getting firsthand accounts, that's hard. You can get it wrong. You can screw up. You can get in trouble that way. So why not just do it the regular way?
And I want to add, that was my experience around this time. I was writing for the New York Daily News, and I did a lot of sports writing. But every once in a while, I would jump out of sports writing and into the case. And one time, I was getting statements from families who were harmed by police. And my editor told me, we need a statement from police. I'm saying, say why? You all issue statements from police all the time, and you don't have family statements. Why do I got to have a statement from police? And they said, that's our policy. And I say that to say it's institutionalized within journalism, which is much different than an individual writing an article. So journalism itself has to be like uprooted from protecting power and privilege to doing actual objective reporting. Susan?
Yeah, no, it's just the standards and the processes. Like, it's a job like any other. Like, you get up, you do things the same way every day, and you know that you can always just take a police statement and treat it as assumed credible without massive evidence otherwise, and your job's done.
Yeah, I was looking at an article that was in the Baltimore Sun about Freddie Gray early on. It was actually this like interactive timeline of what happened during his arrest that they had put on the website, like glossy, high production value. And I counted, and like I think 5% of it holds up as fact now. So they got 95% wrong, but they felt like they were doing their job because it was all police statements. Like the police in the Freddie Gray case, when I talk about the sophistication of the PR operations, you have to understand, like, they really know what they're doing. In the Freddie Gray case, they flooded the public with, like, so much information. This happened at stop 1, this happened at stop 2 at 8:53 and 22 seconds. And so the public was like, oh, and they released all these videos, like CCTV videos, like 5 hours. So the public thought, okay, well, they're being transparent. It's so much information. But they knew what had happened, and they buried the actual information. So it's like a very slick, they are so smart about playing the media, and the media is so, pardon the word, dumb about just like swallowing up what they offer.
Dumb or complicit?
Yeah. I mean, actually, that's a huge question in my book about everybody. Like,
Well, they need content, and they
Yeah.
need it fast, and there actually is not a way to get it fast except for doing it this way and taking the cops their word. So it's an inherent problem in the model.
Okay, so in a few, we're going to go to some questions from the audience. But and we're going to end with you, Justine. But what's the last thought that you really believe the people in the audience should know about with regards to this case, or any other case that you work with? And I'm going to end on you, Justine, but I want to hear from Susan and April and end with you.
What was the question again?
What you have a burning thought that you want to get out that we haven't covered about this case? You want to get it out. What is that? What do people need to know?
Yeah, I mean, the sad thing is, this many years on, and it's been longer than it feels like now, I don't think I've seen any sign that there have been changes made that mean this is not going to happen again. And it's going to happen again. It's just a matter of time.
Yeah, mine is scrutinized. Like we cannot afford. It's almost just like deadly imperative that we scrutinize from the very moment there is an officer killing, murder, brutality, and then we have to ask questions. You cannot accept that just because somebody is an officer, that it is the truth. 9 times out of 10, by the time you could actually see the evidence, no one's talking about it anymore. So my burning, I guess if it was a burning desire, is question everything. We're talking about people's lives, not just in one case, but in all cases.
Yeah, and in this case in particular, I think I always go back to the fact that they came out right away calling it a rough ride. Like, when the police are putting that as their narrative, like, when that's the good version of events, you know something's wrong.
Yeah, I mean, one of my messages has to do with these systems of accountability for policing. I think everything gets folded in, everything that gets called accountability is like folded into cover up. And so that's something that my book lays out is like, there was the autopsy. You think, okay, well, the autopsy is going to be some accountability because it's a body. They can't get that wrong. That's scientific. Well, no, the medical examiner was given certain information and not given other information. There's the force investigation team, internal affairs. Then you had Marilyn Mosby, this prosecutor. Well, I'm going to prosecute the police. Well, her department works with the police, and they ended up going along with the police's story and helping bury evidence. The feds did an investigation. They also lied about the and then there's like police reform. It's all getting folded into it. And we can't ask these systems to reform themselves anymore because their priority is to keep everyone in business.
Yeah, and I want to put a cherry on top of that point because, and you talk a little bit about it in your book. There was an officer, Joe Crystal, I believe his name was, and he came out against the police. And what happened is, as a whistleblower, he found a rat on the hood of his car. When he called for backup, nobody showed up. He had to move down to Florida for the safety of his own life. So what we have to understand is when there is a cop who tries to do good, who tries to say this is criminal behavior, tries to say this is wrong, they get rid of the cop. And so we're not talking about, the old good cop, bad cop. The bad cop is the system itself. The good cop gets ran off the force. If we define a good cop as blowing a whistle, which I believe should be the definition, that if you see something terribly wrong in criminality, you see criminality, that you call that out. So I want to pause there. And first of all, let's hear it for our panelists, and let's hear it for Justine.
This is my most lovable panel. I just find them all so lovable.
Yeah, you all need to read this book. It's so good. It's so meticulous. It really is. And I'm an audiobook person as well. I could multitask, and that's how I went through it. So you could do that as well. But in the audience, you could come up. If anyone has any questions, please come up to the mic up here. So, and just, form a line and whatnot so that we could take some questions that are on your mind.
Well, first of all, you're to be congratulated for writing a book exposing police brutality and media cover-up. But I wonder if there's also a larger concept that's sometimes referred to as the nudge. I don't know if you've heard of that, where some events, not necessarily this Baltimore event, but some of these events may be actually planned in order to further certain agendas like gun control and things like that. And for example, during Obama's period of 8 years, there were events almost like clockwork on every week or twice a week even. And then in 2016, when he left office, somehow they just stopped. I guess there was a different policy, and there's a lot fewer since then. So I wonder if, and that might be actually as important work as you're doing, there might be an even larger pull over the media reporting of some of these larger agendas that are going on that, I mean, you all are allowed to come to Politics and Prose and talk about this book, but there are very few people or book writers that are going to mention anything about this larger issue.
Thank you.
Do you have a response? No, I actually might be a bit confused. Sorry. Are you suggesting that there's like planned police brutality event, like it's performed or something? I'm sorry, I may be misunderstanding. I apologize. You can take my mic if you want.
Well, that's a very interesting question because the whole thing about the nudge is that we don't really know. And all we can do is look at evidence, and that's where good reporting comes in. So you have citizen journalists coming up with all these inconsistencies, and I don't have to tell you, about all these different events, and I'm sure you know, but people don't talk about them publicly. And so in Baltimore, I have no reason to think that, the events, didn't happen without some, larger thing causing it to happen. But there are noble agendas like possibly gun control and also stopping police brutality and changing the whole culture. But sometimes authorities might want to go too far in using the concept called the nudge. And that is a very real thing, and there are books written about it, but in very vague terms.
It's also where the very experienced, essentially crisis PR teams come in, where they don't have to do anything. If they keep doing the kind of reckless things they do, opportunities will come along, and they're ready to use them when they do. And we see that over and over again. Like, they'll find something happen, and they'll change the narrative to make it fit whatever story they're trying to push at the moment. So they get raw material to work with, and they can shape it how they want.
I would say in DC, the nudge is, I haven't heard it called that before, but it makes a lot of sense. It's just regular policing here. So I guess one of the biggest examples that we've been involved with was a group of young men on Sheriff Road. And so what you see is our gun recovery unit walks up on these guys. Again, this has been happening for years to them. And they have a guy that none of the guys know. He comes up, and the police are just like, hey, this is, we're here for the tents. And then this guy comes out from nowhere, and they search him and find a gun. Well, they find this gun, and the officer just takes it and puts it in his back pocket and continues to talk. But from that stop, they then ask everybody for their IDs. They then violate everybody's rights. But it was a way to set it up. The guys knew their rights, but had they not, it was created. The guy, by the way, the guy was able to just get in his car and drive away during all of this. So yeah, I would say that, and then police here will walk up to a group of especially young black men, and they will say, they'll pick one out and say, thanks so much for helping us, giving that information today. We put them on our YouTube page right in front of everybody to cause suspicion for anything that has happened in that community, fueling the violence.
I think the closest example that I could think of what you were talking about as I interpreted it was what I was saying with Endowment Mall and the movement when there's protest to the police try to make it seem more radical and violent than it is. So the riot might be like a nudge because the police absolutely created the conditions for that riot and provoked it. The Baltimore riots, they were provoked by police actions, and I hope the book supports that. So I think that, I definitely think that they're putting out, that for a period of time, they like to create these riots to make people just trying to address police violence seem radical and crazy.
And that people need police.
Yeah,
Yes,
right,
exactly.
right.
The book does support it.
Yes, very
Thank
well.
you.
Gus?
Hello, thank you. Thank you for your work and your contribution. On that larger issue of the propaganda machines, a good book to read for everyone is something called Manufactured Consent. Noam Chomsky, I'm sure some of you may have heard of it. That's a very good book, and what's talked about in that book on a larger level is practice on the local level as well. Two quick questions. One, I studied journalism, and journalism 101 was you're supposed to have two sources before you run with anything. And it sounds to me like that's just totally disregarded with the police.
Not with the police.
So that's, well, yeah, okay. I should have said independent, but I mean, I get your point. So I guess my question is, how do we push the industry itself to abide by what I was taught in college? That's one question. The second question is, I don't hear a whole lot talked about. We talked about Cop City in Atlanta, and I don't hear a whole lot. That's about $90 million price tag. I don't hear a whole lot talked about the pipeline Cop City proposed here for Baltimore, which is about $330 million. How do we get that word out more?
Well, I want to come here, but can you Do you want to say anything more about it? I just learned about this last week, to be honest with you.
Well, it's proposed. One of the sites is Coppin State, and there's a pattern. We see an increasingly number of these sites and venues they put a black face on it, and that tends to give it a little more public approvability, so to speak. And we can talk about that internationally, but that's another piece. So it's proposed for that again, $330 million. Yeah. You can pay for about 22,000 youth summer employment with that. You can pay for nearly 20,000 in child care support for a year, and both of those things have been shown to mitigate crime. So,
yeah, I mean, this Cop City Baltimore thing, I'm dying because Baltimore is like famously the most corrupt department in the country. Like, we have so many scandals. They just indicted like 12, 15 officers and a commissioner, Like, what are we doing training anybody? And honestly, the police department almost completely fell apart a few years ago. Like, they couldn't find anyone to lead it. There were too many indictments. So to me, this is like the apotheosis, the culmination of everything about Baltimore police history is in this moment, because Baltimore police history has been money for reform, money for reform, money for training, and the money keeps going to the same people who messed up. Like the people who created zero tolerance policing, who are mass arresting people, like destroying communities, get paid 10 years later to fix zero tolerance policing. Like, that is what, and I'm looking at the money behind that because I think it's going to happen because Baltimore cannot resist spending money on police reform, which is not reform. It's just money. It goes to these consultants and these lawyers and like these rich people. They love Baltimore because Baltimore is so corrupt and unaccountable. These people, these rich people, love to come to Baltimore and promise to fix things because they know they're going to get a fat paycheck and in 5 years get asked to fix it again. So anyway, that was my answer to that one. It's like it's horrible and interesting because it's a joke. Like, nobody thinks Baltimore should be training people on policing. Most people think that department needs to be disbanded,
Thank you. I have to add, if we're going to talk about new cop cities, where the movement is right now, it's in Atlanta, and there's been a 2.5-year movement to stop a $90 million facility, and there they really believe, and they are correct, that it's a national issue and arguably an international issue, because if it happens there, it will happen in every city, because 2/3 are privately funded. So the mayor, they're going to take that $60 million from private corporations. So we're really looking at the privatization of policing. We're looking at capitalism that is unrestrained in a way that the local city councils can't turn it down. So it's a big deal.
And this is the accountability thing I was talking about. People think, oh, well, it's just police reform and training. At least it's not harmful. But it is harmful because it's more and more money and protective mechanisms to help police get away with whatever they want.
Yes, I just want to thank everyone on the panel for the work that you're doing. It's work that needs to be done, and I think people need to wake up and realize a lot of these scenarios that are taking place with the police using extra violence to maintain law and order is nothing new. In fact, the police were created essentially to police black people on the plantations, and which gave rise to the Second Amendment. They wanted every white person to be able to put their hand on a weapon to not only fight the Indians during the Western expansion, but also to be of assistance for the many slave revolts that were taking place on the plantations. And white fear drives this love affair with weapons. Everybody's running around with their hair on fire for these mass shootings. serial murderers, you name it. It's like one big kabuki theater of horror. And it makes money. But I would like to ask one question. I never got a solid reason why Freddie Gray died. Now, the urban legends that have sprung up are many and varied and may have a grain of truth. I remember the guy that got beat in, I believe it was on video. They said that the guy was dating one of the cops' ex-girlfriends or something like that. And this was an opportunity. He had threatened this guy, and this was his opportunity to get some payback. What did Freddie do that enraged the police, or was that just standard operational procedure because they could, and the force is so corrupt to begin with?
Yeah, so a couple of the officers involved are very violent people, and they had IAD records. Freddie was not doing anything in the morning he was arrested. They hid a lot of the evidence. He and his friends were just walking, like that was it, and he ran. Why his arrest got so violent? I mean, it was a violent set of officers. I think it was because when they initially tased him, he screamed, and then he kept screaming. And as he was screaming, there was a crowd growing. And I think that the more that he responded to the physical pain they were causing.
Wasn't his neck broken?
Well, that happened. So what happened, I should have said this.
Right.
They arrested him. They had already sort of tased and probably kicked and beaten him at the arrest. He was put in the van. He was still okay. I mean, he was in pain, but he wasn't fatally injured. Around the corner, that's what I uncovered. There were like a bunch of witnesses who saw him thrown head first into the van. And so that was the kind of action that caused his vertebrae to flip. It's called a jumped facet injury. But because the medical examiner was never told about those witness statements, she assumed it must have happened while the van was moving, that he got thrown forward.
Yeah.
So it was 2 stops of just violent actions. A lot of it because they were bystanders and they were trying to deal with it. I don't think they meant to kill him. They meant to get him in the van real quickly. They didn't care.
But they were using a level of violence that was bound to kill someone eventually.
Well,
Yeah. They were just like, I'm sure they were surprised too that this happened, but like it was going to happen the way they were acting. And also, there should be a whole series on medical examiners and what a scam they are.
well, I want to just thank all of you for this information because I look at news now basically as a performance, what they call it, infotainment, and maybe 1 or 2 words might be the truth, but mostly it's propaganda to make me think this way about a certain thing when I should be thinking 180 degrees different. But keep up the good work. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, I think part of my question was just answered because you had told us about how the rough ride was not what killed him, and so I was just trying to get a better sense of, and 95% of the article you suggested was not true. So what you're saying is that it was in that second stop when they put him into the van. Can you just talk a little bit about why it was that in at least the prosecutor's investigation that was not either discovered or was not used, and then secondly, kind of fast forward, you sound pretty skeptical of any police reform. There is the consent decree that was implemented. They've got a whole variety of reforms that are supposed to be taking place, and it sounds like you view that as pretty meaningless.
Well, the consent decree is actually not the federal government. It's a bunch of lawyers and police consultants, and it's a law firm. And the consent decree is designed to go on for.
But it was part of the pattern of practice investigation by the Justice Department in the Civil Rights Division.
Right, but when it comes to how the consent decree is implemented, they hire a law firm. It's usually a very powerful local law firm. In our case, it's Venable. And the law firm is then entrusted with everything. So the feds are kind of actually not involved, to be honest. And so part of why people are skeptical of the consent decree is that it's a lot of times they're just instituting reforms that had already been instituted, you know. The problem isn't like training and policy, the problem is accountability. And at least in Baltimore, the consent decree does not deal with that question. If you tell them we have corrupt cops, this cop beat me up, they'll say take it to internal affairs. But we trained internal affairs, so you can trust them. Does that make some sense? That's just how it works in reality.
Okay.
And I write about it in the book. There's about the consent decree. It's the, so.
And I take it that, I mean, there is a judge as well, but your view is that she's not getting
well, the judge
or
in
he's not
Baltimore
getting-
said, you know, when people started to talk about like the police, he said the police department's too big to fail. They're all like very conservative. It's about maintaining. There's a long history of this with police reform movements actually being designed to kind of whitewash the reputations. I know, I can tell that you're skeptical of what I'm saying, but I do want to answer. I want to answer your other question because it's more important, which was the Marilyn Mosby's prosecution. Like, that really is the money question. Like, why didn't they pursue the real case?
Right.
And there's a lot of answers in my book. But I will say that it wasn't because they didn't know. They knew right away. They interviewed their own witnesses who said that they saw him thrown headfirst into the van, and their notes indicate it. There's a lot of political machinations going on that I outline in the book in terms of why everybody decided on this one narrative as opposed to the real story. I do think it has to do with like limiting liability. And they wanted to like quell the protests, and if it was just like one driver, then it wasn't like a lot of cops were involved in what happened to him, you know. It's a lot. You know?
I don't want to say I'm sympathetic exactly. I feel like I have more understanding for the prosecutors and the struggles they had with this case. I mean, when you say the prosecutors, it's not just the DA, it's all the underlings hand in this case. It was like fundamentally a hard case to begin with. Like, it was a very hard case to prosecute just by the nature of it. You have a lot of actors who have a piece of the pie, and a lot of them, probably maybe even all of them, don't know for certain what happened. So there's already just a diffuse knowledge, diffuse involvement. That's going to be hard to prosecute whatever the case is.
Well, it is, but I have a question, Susan. If the four of us were in that van as civilians and someone died in that van, would the laws be different that all four of us, regardless of whoever severed Freddie Gray's spine, would all be in jail?
They definitely would have had an easier time with it, but yeah, it still would have been a hard case, actually.
Really?
I do think so.
Okay.
Yeah. If there were more of us? Well, so in that scenario, everyone's in the van. Someone can claim they saw what happened for sure. In this case, they could never, ever have like one witness to say, I know for sure what happened, because it's possible that witness doesn't exist. So it was just for a prosecutor, it was a really hard case. And they were not supported the way they needed for fact-finding. They were trying to cobble together a narrative that they thought they could sell. I think some of those prosecutors truly believe the rough ride was their best bet of selling a story, because they're used to telling not the true story to get convictions. They're used to finding the best version they need to get the conviction. So I think in their heads doing the same thing here. Like the rough ride story, not the best, but like it's running the calculations. This might win when others will not.
That's so crazy to me. She's
an attorney.
Yeah. No, and I get that, and I guess that's what makes it so crazy is that think of all the ways that you could die, and then all the ways people could tell a story about the way that you die, and that it's based off of things that may have nothing to do with you or the people who are in the court. And the fact that that is what we are trying to get accountability for is why I don't believe that you can get accountability from an unaccountable system.
Wow.
I think you're all giving the big media far more credit for power and authority that they don't really have. But my question, I'm always fascinated by political vocabulary, and I only recall the word defund being used by conservatives to try to strip funding away from Planned Parenthood. And whatever it means, it has not promoted effective police reform or legal reform. What's your reaction?
That's not what it was meant to do. It really meant take away money from them. It's not about reform. It's about they get too much money, and the money they have isn't and cannot achieve what they want to achieve. If people are saying we need police to do these things, but we keep putting millions of dollars into a black hole and ending up in the same place, they are not able to, or the money isn't the answer. So defund them.
Someone who can do it right.
Right. And the people who can do it right are the people who know and have the belief in the root causes of what we think police should take care of after the fact. And that is where that money needs to go. I don't know anybody who gets paid and then they keep giving, like, the person who cuts their grass money week after week, but that person doesn't show up. Like, defund from your pocketbooks as taxpayers, as people in a community, and stop if you want to give me the money, that's great. Like, you could just stop taking the money out of my taxes, because you're literally not doing the thing. You cannot do the thing that you're taking it out of my check for. I would rather be able to feed my neighbors.
And I guess my suggestion would be analyze the police budget better, or something like that.
And
But
that's
it's also
defunded.
It's not just the budget, though. It's also the idea that, like, this sort of baseline assumption that every ill in society, the police are there to fix it or can fix it. And, like, no, like, even the best case scenario, the best police force ever, the police just aren't the ones you want handling a lot of that stuff. Like, you just don't want them. They don't want to do it either. So why are we throwing all this money at them so they can be social workers?
And let's be clear, when we do analyze budgets, the information comes back is that only 8% of all calls are for violent crimes. So 92% of calls have nothing to do with violent crimes, but in the public imagination, police are often solving murders and rapists. It's not about that. It's how do we take from TV. How do we take those 92% and reallocate them into other mental health counselors who may have half the salary and half the resources go to them, but they're twice as qualified? Or schools. Yeah. We don't hear every time a school gets defunded, they don't say defund schools, that politicians for that. So we have to have a different messaging. We have to have an education system, but people really don't know much about police and police budgets.
Arlington's trying mental health stuff right now. Take a look at it.
I mean, I think the obsession with, like, the right slogan and this kind of, like, talking down to activists. You don't have the right slogan. It doesn't matter what slogan the activists come up with, because, like I said, the police department is very well funded to spin it as dangerous. So they're going to do that with whatever you say. You could say fund flowers. They'd be like, these anarchists, you know? Sorry.
Black Lives Matter is the most benign statement ever, and they turn that into a terrorist organization, right? So, I mean, anyway, go ahead.
There's twofold. You discuss in the book there's a lot of conversation about between the police and the media and the relationship there, but is there a relationship between the state's attorney's office and the media and investigative journalists? I believe you talked about that a little bit in your book. And also to segue into one of the comments that was just made about prosecuting the case and it being a difficult prosecution, is that maybe because the two main prosecutors had never tried a homicide case before, in spite of having experienced, well-seasoned prosecutors in the homicide division, but they were not used. It was the two that had just joined the administration and never prosecuted a homicide before.
So in terms of the media and DAs, I feel like in most jurisdictions, the police like blow the DAs out of the water when it comes to their PR operation. Like the DAs do have, PR in mind. They do care about that, but like I've never actually encountered a DA or that really has the system worked out the way the police do. They're usually coming at it from like a lawyer point of view and like trying to work it in a more limited fashion. They don't usually have a person who's like dedicated to like a PR as its own field. So they're usually not as capable in sort of spinning that stuff. And they're also limited when they can say in terms of like court regulations. So the DAs, in my mind, aren't the big problem in terms of like this cop, law enforcement, media pipeline.
Yeah, I mean, she's right for this case. Like, Mosby mostly followed, like, the rules in terms of her office didn't share or leak as much, and they were upset. They got a gag order because the police were just doing it constantly, leaking these fake stories that Freddie banged his head, etc., through using motions to leak stuff. So, but I would say Marilyn Mosby did cultivate the national media. So she really raised her profile
Yeah,
nationally.
it's more focused on like getting. It's more individual based. It's more
Yes,
politically based than it
political.
is about the organization.
And that happens in other places
Yeah.
too. Like a lot of us know about
Everywhere,
that
yeah.
that DA in Philadelphia. That DA we learn like Krasner. We learn about them because of their national PR efforts. A lot like Mosby, for instance, at a certain she didn't really care about the Baltimore Press because she was busy with Vogue and the New York Times. So and your other question, now I'm blanking.
About the prosecutors they signed.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so that the person who asked that question worked in that office and so is familiar. But it is a part of the book, which is that the people who decided to try the case in court were not experienced prosecutors and were very high up in the department. And it's all just more evidence that it was politically motivated instead of motivated by, the law. So yeah, that's a very good point.
Okay, so the politics and prose police are here right now.
Fund.
Fund politics and prose.
Go buy this
No,
book.
seriously, let's hear it for politics and prose first, because they're giving us an avenue to talk about what won't be talked about in a lot of places. And let's hear it for our panel and Justine.
Thank you all so much.